In the quiet curl of an evening wind that slipped through the crooked beams of tavern rooftops, there existed a kind of life that many thought glamorous, from afar but very few ever wished to truly live: the life of a medieval bard. People who heard the gentle plucking of lutes or the whisper of a tired voice at a lord's table assumed the bard belonged to a world of charm, of adventure, of stories spun like gold threads beneath candlelight. But those assumptions twinkled only on the surface, shimmering like a thin frost that melts when touched. Underneath it all, beneath the polished performances and the half-remembered songs, being a bard was a slow, exhausting, unpredictable existence that rarely felt fair or magical. And this particular truth unfurled like a long, weary tapestry in the life of Rowan of Brookfen, who wandered more roads than he slept in proper beds. Rowan had been born into a village so small that even the crows hesitated to land there, unsure if it was worth their time. His earliest memory was of listening to an old man pluck the strings of a faded lute. The man was not even a real bard, just someone who had once traveled further than the village mill, and had gathered a handful of melodies like pebbles in a pocket. Rowan, enchanted, thought that learning songs was like gathering treasures. When the old man died, Rowan inherited the lute, though he didn't inherit any wealth, skills, or even a roof that didn't leak. But he believed the wooden instrument carried a destiny of its own, as though it hummed with possibilities whenever he touched it. What Rowan did not yet know was that the lute also hummed with splinters, broken strings, unequal payments, long nights, and the endless ache of walking from one village to the next, hoping anyone would spare a crust of bread in exchange for a song they had already heard 100 times. He became a bard because it was the only path that seemed open, the only thing he felt he could do without being mocked or dismissed. But once he began, he discovered that bards were only admired when they were unfamiliar. The moment one returned a second time to a village, listeners would lean back, arms crossed, expecting new wonders, new stories, new verses. And if Rowan dared to repeat a familiar ballad, the people would sigh loudly, like cattle annoyed by flies. This was the first problem with being a bard. No one understood how long it took to invent new songs. And so Rowan walked. He walked through muddy roads that clung to his boots like stubborn memories. He walked through forests where the trees seemed to whisper that he was foolish for choosing this life. He walked across bridges that creaked as if judging his poor financial decisions. He sang at markets where half the crowd listened and the other half haggled loudly over cabbages. He entertained nobles who rarely looked at him, their eyes fixed on their venison, while he poured fragments of his soul into every note. He sang lullabies to crying children whose mothers never paid him, reasoning that soothing a child's tantrum was reward enough. What Rowan discovered slowly was that a bard was expected to be more than a singer. People expected him to be a historian, a comedian, a philosopher, a healer, a gossip source, and occasionally a jester, depending on the mood of the room. They expected him to know recent events in distant towns, even though he himself had heard only rumors through the scattered chatter of travelers. They expected him to write bawdy songs for feasts, solemn songs for funerals, heroic songs for knights, romantic songs for maidens, agricultural songs for farmers, and if there happened to be a goat nearby, someone would inevitably shout for a goat-themed ballad. This was the second problem with being a bard. Everyone assumed the bard knew everything. In reality, Rowan rarely knew what day it was. One late autumn afternoon, as golden leaves fell around him like tired applause, Rowan reached the village of Hardhill. He was hungry, though hunger had become so familiar that he barely noticed it anymore, as if it were another companion walking beside him. His lute was missing 2 strings, so all his melodies sounded slightly melancholy, even the cheerful ones. A bard without money for strings was like a knight without armor. But unlike knights, bards did not receive government funding or shiny suits. Instead, Rowan did what many bards before him had done. He pretended the sound was intentional. When he entered Hardhill, he immediately saw a gathering at the square. A village gathering often meant opportunity, so Rowan stepped forward, straightened his ragged tunic, and cleared his throat. "Would anyone like a song?" he asked, trying to sound professional. The villagers turned to look at him. Some raised eyebrows, some whispered, some simply blinked slowly, unimpressed. One child pointed and asked, "What happened to your lute? Did a wolf chew it?" "No," Rowan replied tiredly. "Just time." An old woman approached him, her shawl draped so loosely it nearly touched the ground. "Do you know the ballad of the Silver Crow?" she asked, Rowan had never heard of that song. Or perhaps he had heard of it but forgot it, for he had learned so many ballads that they blended together into one tangled knot of verse and rhythm. I can learn it, he offered. The woman sniffed. Then come back when you know it, as she walked away. This was the third problem with being a bard. People expected perfection, not effort. But Rowan did not give up. He trudged toward the tavern, the Bent Barrel, which smelled like beer, onions, and questionable life choices. Taverns were usually welcoming to bards, at least in the sense that they allowed bards to stand in a dark corner and sing for the chance of a single copper coin rolling under a table. Rowan approached the barkeep, a broad man with arms thicker than Rowan's entire torso. I can perform tonight, Rowan offered. I ask only for food and a room. The barkeep mulled this over. You any good? I am consistent, Rowan answered truthfully. Fine, the barkeep said. Play during the supper rush. If people stay, you get stew. If they leave, you clean dishes. This was the fourth problem with being a bard. You were only as valuable as the amount of noise people tolerated while eating. That evening, Rowan played. Or rather, he attempted to play, coaxing music from his worn lute like someone trying to wake a sleeping cat without getting scratched. The strings buzzed. The notes wobbled. But Rowan's voice, though tired, still held a warmth that drifted across the tavern like soft firelight. He sang of nights and rivers, of queens and forgotten kingdoms, of small joys and large sorrows. Some villagers listened, some drank, some shouted for him to sing louder. One man loudly insisted he sing quieter. Another asked for a song about ale, then fell asleep before Rowan finished the first verse. After an hour, the barkeep tossed him a bowl of stew, a watery mixture containing what might have once been vegetables and what definitely had once been disappointment. Still, Rowan was grateful. Gratitude was a bard's most reliable income. That night, he slept in a cold room above the tavern, listening to the distant laughter below. He wondered, as he often did, whether any of the great bards of legend had actually existed or if they were invented by exhausted travelers who wanted to imagine that someone, somewhere, had succeeded in this profession. The next morning, before Rowan had fully woken, someone knocked on his door. A young woman peeked inside. Are you the bard? She asked. Rowan rubbed his eyes. Yes. My brother is getting married today. We need someone to sing, but we can't pay you. Can you feed me? She considered. We can spare a roll of bread, Rowan sighed. I'll be there. This was the fifth problem with being a bard. People believed exposure and bread were acceptable currencies. At the wedding, Rowan sang a gentle melody while the couple exchanged vows. But halfway through the ceremony, a goat wandered into the gathering and began nibbling on Rowan's cloak. The guests laughed. The couple posed for a painting afterward, and they wanted the goat included. They did not ask Rowan to be included. The goat received more attention than he did. Rowan wandered on after the ceremony, heading toward the next village not because he wanted to, but because that was the only life available to him, a path stitched together by half-earned coins, half-remembered songs, and half-asleep audiences. Along the way, Rowan encountered a fellow bard named Lysa. She carried a harp nearly as tall as she was, and her clothing was patched so heavily that the original fabric had become a rumor. When Rowan told her he was struggling, she laughed. Struggling? Then you are definitely a bard, she said. If you were comfortable, you would be a noble. The two traveled together for a while, sharing songs, stories, and the occasional stale loaf of bread. Traveling with another bard was a comfort, mostly because someone finally understood the daily trials. Blisters on feet, aching shoulders from heavy instruments. Innkeepers who claimed they'd already paid you when they definitely had not, and villagers who insisted that musicians should be naturally cheerful no matter how little sleep they'd had. Rowan discovered that Lisa had an even worse problem than he did. She was allergic to cats, and medieval taverns always had at least 7 of them wandering freely, shedding fur, hopping onto laps, and demanding food. Every time a cat brushed against her leg, her eyes watered so intensely that she couldn't see the strings of her harp, leading her to accidentally play haunting, off-key notes that startled patrons into crossing themselves. Yet she kept playing. This was the 6th problem with being a bard. You couldn't have weaknesses, because the world rarely slowed down to accommodate them. One evening, Rowan and Lysa reached the town of Marwick just as a rainstorm began to swallow the sky. They rushed into the nearest shelter, which happened to be a stable. There, among horses who looked at them with profound disinterest, They sat on a pile of hay, hoping dawn would bring dry clothes and a chance to perform somewhere in town. But Marwick presented a new challenge. The town had a resident bard already, Master Brendwin, a man who owned 3 instruments, wore red velvet cloaks, and introduced himself as the renowned Brendwin, the locally famous. He saw Rowan and Lysa as competition, even though they had never met him before. Brendwin cornered them near the tavern entrance. "This town is mine," he declared dramatically. "I have rights to all performances in this district." "Is that an official law?" Rowan asked. "No," Brendwin admitted. "But it feels like it should be." The tavern owner confirmed this in his own blunt way. "Brendwin plays here every night. People expect him. If I let you two play, he'll pout for a week." And so Rowan and Lysa were turned away. Not because they lacked talent. Not because they demanded too much pay. But simply because the local bard had seniority in the world's least glamorous profession. They camped outside the tavern that night, listening to Brendwin's muffled performance through the walls. He sang a heroic ballad off-key, mixing up 2 verses, accidentally repeating the 3rd verse 3 times, but the audience cheered anyway. "Must be nice to be mediocre and still paid," Lysa muttered. "Must be nice to be warm," Rowan added. The next morning, Rowan tried performing in the town square for passing villagers. A small crowd gathered, mostly children and old men with nothing better to do. Rowan tried to sing loudly enough to distract himself from the rumbling in his stomach. But before he could finish a song, the town reeve approached. "You can't perform here," the reeve said. Brendwin filed a complaint. "A complaint?" Rowan asked. "About what?" "About you existing near his sound territory." "My what?" Rowan blinked. "His sound territory," the reeve repeated. "I don't understand it either, but he paid for the complaint parchment, so it must be legitimate. And so, Rowan was banned from performing in any corner of the town where people could hear him, which was everywhere. This was the 7th problem with being a bard. Territorial politics over music were taken far more seriously than anyone expected. After their expulsion, Rowan and Lysa left Marwick in silence. They trudged through mud, their clothes soaked from the night before, their instruments wrapped in cloaks to protect them from the drizzle that refused to stop. After several miles, they found shelter beneath an ancient oak tree whose roots twisted like the fingers of some old storyteller. There, Rowan asked aloud the question that had followed him for years. "Why do we even keep doing this?" Lysa sighed. "Because we don't know how to stop." "If I stopped playing, the silence would hurt more." Rowan nodded. He understood. Being a bard was misery, but not being a bard felt like forgetting how to breathe. They parted ways shortly after, each returning to their own wandering paths. Rowan headed south, where the roads were dustier and the inns more suspicious. He encountered thieves who assumed his loot case held coins. When they opened it and found only a piece of cheese and a broken quill, they returned the loot and apologized. He spent 1 winter performing for travelers at a roadside inn where the draft was so strong that every performance became a duet between him and the wind whistling through the walls. Some nights he sang to only one person, an old farmer who fell asleep halfway through every song. Rowan never woke him. Sleeping audiences were better than no audiences. One spring, he was hired by a minor lord to perform at a feast celebrating the lord's victory in a local dispute. Rowan arrived to find that the feast was just stale bread and weak ale, and the victory was simply the lord winning an argument with his neighbor over the placement of a fence. Rowan played anyway, and the lord paid him with a pair of socks. Not even new socks. This was the 8th problem with being a bard. Payment was a gamble and usually a disappointing one. Years passed in this slow, meandering way. The world changed in small ways, but Rowan remained the same wandering bard, drifting between villages like a leaf caught in an endless breeze. His lute grew older. His voice became rougher. His shoes wore thin, but he kept going, one tired melody at a time. One evening, Rowan found himself near a castle gate just as torches were being lit. A guard approached him, not with hostility but curiosity. "Bard," the guard said, "do you know any songs about patience?" Rowan nodded. "I know many songs that require it." The guard smiled faintly. "The queen is ill. She cannot sleep. Perhaps your music could help." Rowan followed the guard into the castle. The halls smelled of lavender and candle wax. The queen lay in her chamber, pale and quiet, her eyelids trembling as though dreams chased her even while she was awake. Rowan played a lullaby, not one of legend, not one of grandeur, but a simple, soft tune he had written long ago while sitting beside a riverbank. It was a melody stitched from loneliness, from long roads, from nights spent beneath stars. And as he played, the queen's breathing slowed. Her face relaxed, her eyelids fluttered shut. When he finished, the chamber was silent, peaceful. The court physician approached. "She sleeps," he whispered. "The first peaceful sleep in days," Rowan nodded, unsure how to respond. The next morning, the queen awoke refreshed and calm. She requested Rowan return for several more nights, and each time he played, she drifted easily into slumber. This led to the 9th problem with being a bard. Sometimes the most meaningful things you did were invisible to everyone except one person. When Rowan finally prepared to leave, expecting only a small pouch of coins, the queen surprised him. She handed him a new lute beautifully carved, finely tuned, with strings that hummed like sunlight woven into sound. "For your music," she said softly. "It carries more healing than many medicines." Rowan left the castle that day feeling something he had not felt in a long time, a quiet sense of worth. He continued his wandering, but now the melodies flowed more easily. Villages listened more closely. Taverns clapped more sincerely. Children followed him through the streets, begging for another tune. And though he still faced hardships, muddy roads, frugal audiences, demanding nobles, territorial bards, he carried with him the memory of a queen whose sleepless nights had been soothed by his music. And so Rowan lived, not in glory or fame, not in comfort or wealth, but in the gentle glow of a life where his music mattered, even when the world made his profession feel exhausting and thankless. Because in the end, that was the deepest truth about being a medieval bard. It sucked in countless ways, truly, deeply, relentlessly sucked, but every now and then, in a quiet moment when someone needed it most, a bard's song could soften the world. And that one small softness was enough to keep a bard walking, singing, and wandering through the centuries, long after the hardships had faded into the distance like the last echo of a fading note. Rowan wandered on from the castle with the new lute strapped carefully across his back, as though carrying something fragile and luminous. The instrument wasn't heavy, but it held a weight of a different sort. A gentle responsibility that neither slowed him nor hurried him, but merely reminded him that every path he walked now carried a new kind of echo. Even so, it did not free him from the quiet miseries of a bard's life. Roads were still long, boots still tore, and people still believed that music alone could sustain a man without need for rest, food, or warmth. One soft dusk, Rowan arrived at a roadside inn called the Meadow's Whistle, though nobody seemed able to explain what exactly in the meadow ever whistled. The sign was crooked, the paint fading, and the air around it smelled faintly of damp straw and recently argued over recipes. Rowan stepped inside and was greeted by a warmth that felt more like accidental fire hazard than hospitality. The innkeeper looked up, squinting at Rowan with suspicion, as though trying to determine whether he was a musician or simply a man with an oddly shaped backpack. "Evenin'," the innkeeper grunted. "You selling songs, stories, or trouble?" "Only songs," Rowan answered. "Trouble is extra." The innkeeper chuckled, a rare sight for someone with eyebrows angled as sharply as his. "Fine, you play later." "Supper crowd likes music. Sometimes, if they're not arguing." "Or asleep," Rowan nodded. "I can work with that." He sat in a dim corner and took out the queen's lute. Even in the dusty tavern light, the polished wood gleamed softly. A few villagers glanced over, whispering. They could tell this instrument was not born from a village market cart, nor had it spent its life in taverns where mugs were used as percussion instruments. Rowan strummed it once, and the note rang clear, smooth, almost startlingly pure. Even the inn's usual background clatter paused for a heartbeat. And then supper began. The crowd arrived. Farmers who smelled like fields and honest labor travelers, wrapped tightly in cloaks, a merchant, arguing loudly with his own boots, and a pair of shepherds who looked as though they had never agreed on anything since childhood. Rowan played softly at first, letting his music settle like dust in sunlight. Slowly conversations quieted. People leaned forward, not because the music demanded it, but because something about the sound felt like remembering a dream they'd forgotten. Rowan sang a gentle tale of wandering geese who had lost their way, but found comfort in the rhythm of their wings. Then he sang an old lullaby about the moon watching from behind drifting clouds, steady and patient. He noticed several children falling asleep against their parents, And even the merchant who had been arguing with his boots earlier now stared into his mug, as though reconsidering his life choices. But just as Rowan felt a rare contentment warming his chest, a large man at the back suddenly stood up. "That's enough slow songs," he boomed. "Play something lively. Something worth dancing to." Rowan nodded politely. Of course, he adjusted his posture, prepared for a cheerful tune. But just as he plucked the first bright chord, a woman across the room shouted, "No! Keep it soft, my baby just fell asleep." The large man growled, "I walked 5 miles for a drink and a dance." The woman scowled, "And I've walked 5 months carrying this child." And thus began an argument that had absolutely nothing to do with Rowan, yet somehow placed him directly in the line of fire. This was yet another problem with being a bard. Everyone believed the bard was responsible for their mood, their preferences, and their children's sleep schedules. The innkeeper intervened. "Quiet, he'll play what he plays, and if you don't like it, argue outside." The large man grumbled but sat down. Rowan resumed playing, choosing a slow piece that wouldn't wake the baby. The baby promptly woke anyway, not from the music, but from the shepherds beginning a new argument about whether sheep preferred hills or valleys. The baby wailed loud enough to silence every other sound. Rowan kept playing. Sometimes being a bard meant pretending nothing unusual was happening, even when chaos unfolded like a dropped basket of live chickens. Eventually, the argument died down, the baby yawned itself asleep again, and Rowan's song reached its end soft, unhurried, unbothered. When he finished, the inn was quiet in a peaceful, slightly exhausted way. A few people clapped half-heartedly, not because they didn't appreciate him, but because clapping felt too energetic for the atmosphere. The innkeeper handed Rowan a mug of warm cider. "You did well," he said. "Managed not to anger anyone permanently. That's a talent." "Thank you," Rowan replied. "Does this count as payment?" "For now," the innkeeper said. "If you want a room for the night, you'll have to sweep the stables." Rowan smiled weakly. He had slept in worse places than a stable, but cleaning one first seemed poetic in a mildly unfortunate way. He accepted. Later, as he swept hay, dust, and odd smells from corners of the stable, Rowan thought about all the inns, all the nights, all the people who had come and gone in his wandering life. He wondered if anyone ever truly understood the path he walked. It wasn't the hardships that troubled him most, they had become as familiar as his own voice. Rather, it was the strange loneliness of always moving, always performing, always giving little pieces of himself to people who would forget his name by sunrise. But then, from the tavern window above, he heard someone humming his melody, the lullaby he'd played earlier. The sound drifted through the cool night air, quiet, hesitant, but unmistakably repeating the notes he had woven. For a moment, Rowan leaned on his broom and simply listened. It wasn't fame, it wasn't wealth. It wasn't even a proper bed, but it was something. It reminded him that bards carried more than songs. They carried traces of themselves that lived on in strangers, small echoes that lingered long after they left. Even in a life that seemed endlessly inconvenient, thankless, and cold, moments like this stitched warmth into the edges of the world. He finished sweeping, leaned his broom against the wall, and sat down on a bundle of hay. The new lute lay beside him, glowing faintly in the lantern light. Rowan plucked a quiet chord, more to himself than anyone else. The night was calm. The stars were unbothered. The world, for once, did not demand anything from him. And so he played just for the night, just for the silence, just for the simple truth that even when the life of a bard sucked in nearly every imaginable way, the music never did. Rowan awoke the next morning in the stable with a faint ache in his neck, the kind that comes from sleeping in a position no human body was ever meant to endure. A thin beam of morning sunlight slipped through a gap in the wooden boards, lighting up drifting specks of dust that moved lazily, as though even they were too tired to fully commit to floating. He stretched, quietly thanked his past self for not attempting to sleep directly on a pitchfork, and stepped outside, blinking into the pale dawn. The world felt cold but calm. Birds chirped with the sort of enthusiasm Rowan wished he could borrow. He slung the lute across his shoulder and made his way toward the road, offering the innkeeper a polite farewell. The innkeeper handed him a small loaf of slightly stale bread in exchange. "Travel safe," the innkeeper said. "If the sheep from last night's argument show up looking angry, I'll send them your way." Rowan chuckled. "Please don't," and then he set off. Rowan walked for hours through open fields where dew clung to wild grass, sparkling like scattered coins he wished he actually had. The road wound gently forward, narrowing then widening, sometimes turning abruptly as though it had changed its mind about where it wanted to go. By midday, Rowan reached a fork in the path, one road leading toward a distant village, and the other toward a forest with trees so tall and tightly packed they formed a wall of green shadows. Rowan remembered what other travelers had told him about the forest. Don't go in unless you want to get lost. But bards often found themselves going places people told them not to. Curiosity and necessity were two ropes that pulled constantly at Rowan's life, so he stepped toward the forest with more caution than enthusiasm. The air inside was cooler, the light dimmer, the silence deeper. Leaves rustled overhead with the soft shiver of 1,000 whispered secrets. Rowan kept to the path, though it twisted strangely, as if unsure whether it wanted to exist. After some distance, he heard something, a faint melody drifting between the trees, high and thin like a flute played far away. Rowan paused, listening carefully. It wasn't wind, it wasn't birds. It was unmistakably music. He followed the sound, drawn by curiosity and the instinctive pull musicians feel when they encounter another melody. The flute-like notes dipped and rose, growing clearer as he approached a small clearing. There, sitting on a fallen log, was an old man with hair long enough to braid twice, playing a wooden pipe with his eyes closed. The melody was simple but haunting, like something the forest itself might hum when nobody was listening. Rowan waited respectfully until the old man finished. Only then did the man open one eye, then the other, studying Rowan with mild amusement. "A bard," the man said. "Not a question. A recognition. And carrying a lute too fine for those boots." Rowan glanced down at his boots, which had truly seen better centuries. "I earned it," he said. "Mostly by accident. That's how most things are earned," the man replied. "Come, sit." Rowan sat on the grass. "Your song was beautiful," the man nodded. "Forrest taught it to me. I just borrowed it back. Are you also a bard?" Rowan asked. The old man laughed softly. "I was. Long before your voice cracked for the first time. I traveled roads that do not exist anymore. Played in halls now buried in ruin. Learned songs from kings, thieves, and people who insisted they were neither. Did you like it?" Rowan asked, though he already suspected the answer. The old man sighed, brushing a leaf from his robe. "Music was a joy. The life was tiring, but bards give more than people realize. They pour stories into empty rooms. They soothe the weary, they stitch together the memories of strangers. And in return, they receive coins that barely buy supper and beds that barely count as furniture." "So, it wasn't just me," Rowan murmured. The old man shook his head. "Never just you. Every bard walks the same road, though each sees it differently." Rowan hesitated before asking, "Then why keep walking it?" The man smiled gently, a smile with equal parts wisdom and weariness. "Because someone has to carry the stories. If we don't, the world forgets itself." The old man lifted his pipe again, but paused before playing. "Play something for me, Bard of the Road." Rowan took out his lute and plucked a small melody, a lullaby he'd once written without realizing it would become one of his favorites. The new instrument resonated beautifully, filling the clearing with warm, soft sound that drifted upward like smoke. The old man listened with closed eyes. When Rowan finished, the old man nodded approvingly. "You carry your burden well," he said. "Even if it sometimes feels heavier than it should." Rowan looked around the quiet forest. "Do you live here?" "I wonder," the old man answered. "Same as you, just slower now." The man stood, joints creaking like old wood. "Be careful out there. The world is loud these days. Many voices shout, few truly listen. But yours," he tapped Rowan's lute gently. "People will remember, even when you think they won't." And with that, the old bard walked into the trees, vanishing almost as though the forest had opened a doorway just for him. Rowan sat a moment longer, letting the forest quiet settle around him. Then he stood, slung his lute over his shoulder, and continued down the path. By late afternoon he reached a village named Briarwick, where smoke curled from chimneys and children played in the dust. Rowan approached the central square where people gathered around a well. When they saw he carried a lute, their faces lit with curiosity, always a promising sign. "Are you a bard?" one woman asked. "Yes," Rowan said. "Will you sing for us?" another chimed. I can, Rowan said. What would you like to hear? The villagers murmured among themselves. Then a small boy stepped forward. Can you sing something calming? The boy asked quietly. Softer than the world? Rowan nodded. He sat on the edge of the well, took out his lute, and began to play the melody the old man had played in the forest soft, drifting, like a memory trying to return home. The villagers fell silent. Even the children stopped moving, listening with wide eyes. The music drifted through Briarwick like a gentle breeze, smoothing the edges of the day. Somewhere in the back of the crowd, an old woman wiped a tear from her cheek. When the song ended, nobody clapped. They simply breathed deeply, as though a heaviness they hadn't noticed had lifted. A man stepped forward and handed Rowan a basket of apples. Another gave him a small pouch of coins. A child offered him a flower already wilting at the edges. Rowan accepted each gift with quiet gratitude. That evening, he sat beside a small fire outside the village, eating one of the apples, which tasted far sweeter than anything he had eaten in weeks. He strummed a few lazy melodies, letting the notes drift into the twilight. For the first time in a long while, Rowan felt something warm settle in his chest. Not pride, not ambition, but a quiet sense of belonging, even if just for a moment. Life as a medieval bard still sucked, of course. It was exhausting and lonely, unpredictable and undervalued. But somehow, through all of that, the world had carved out small pockets of kindness moments when music softened hearts, stirred memories, or helped strangers breathe a little easier. And Rowan knew, as he watched the fire flicker softly in the grass, that he would keep walking, keep singing, keep wandering. Because somewhere, on some distant road, another village waited for a song they didn't yet know they needed. Liu. The road kept stretching on beneath Rowan's sore feet, an endless brown ribbon winding through fields that always looked the same. Every step made the lute on his back bounce slightly, and every bounce sent a dull ache through his shoulders. In the soft morning fog, he could hear distant bells ringing from some small church. But like every other sound in medieval life, it only reminded him how far he still had to go to reach the next village. The dew clung to his boots. His throat felt scratchy from singing 6 hours the night before. And his stomach made a quiet, petulant complaint, the sort of hollow rumble that meant he'd eaten mostly onions and coarse bread for the past 3 days. He tried to ignore it. A starving bard was not impressive after all, and if he ever wanted to be invited to the richer feasts, well, he needed to look at least slightly lively. But being lively at dawn after singing until midnight was not something medieval life understood. He hummed a tune to keep his spirits up, but even that felt lazy and unenthusiastic. Why does every song sound the same? He muttered to himself. He had heard that remark too many times from listeners who had no idea how hard it was to remember hundreds of verses without writing them down. A bard's memory was his entire career, and memories were annoyingly slippery. More than once he had forgotten the name of a noble's grandfather midway through a performance, or mixed up the ending of an old heroic ballad, or accidentally added an improvised detail that angered someone important. Mistakes like that didn't get a bard applause. Mistakes got him extra unpaid nights at inns, where the innkeeper shrugged and said, "Maybe next time don't insult the lord of the land." Rowan sighed so deeply it fogged the air. Around him, the fields brightened as the sun finally dragged itself over the horizon. Birds began their chirping, cheerful, relentless chirping that somehow made Rowan feel even more exhausted. Birds never had to perform for suspicious nobles. Birds never had to flatter people they didn't like. Birds never had to sleep in stables because the inn was full or too expensive. And worst of all, birds didn't have to pretend they loved every town, every feast, every host. A bard had to smile so much that Rowan's jaw sometimes hurt more than his hands. He trudged forward, adjusting the strap of his lute. The wooden instrument had carried him through dozens of festivals, gatherings, and poorly illuminated taverns, and yet it still threatened to rattle apart every time the humidity changed. In medieval times, climate control didn't exist, so instruments warped, cracked, or went out of tune at the slightest hint of weather. Rainy season? Disaster? Winter? The strings stiffened. Summer? Everything swelled and sounded wrong. Rowan often joked to himself, because no one else laughed, that his lute was more temperamental than any noble woman he had sung for. The road bent slightly, and he saw a cluster of thatched roofs ahead, the next village. Thin smoke drifted lazily from chimneys, curling upward like sleepy ghosts. Rowan rubbed his eyes, imagining all the possible interactions waiting for him. Would the villagers ask for songs he didn't know? Probably. Would someone challenge him with, "My cousin knows a better version of that ballad"? Definitely. Would the children gather around him, tugging at his sleeves, begging for the one silly tune about the dancing pig until he wanted to scream? Without a doubt. And the tavern keeper, oh, the tavern keeper would almost certainly say the same thing all tavern keepers said: "Can you play first? Payment later." Rowan muttered under his breath, "It always means payment never." As he entered the village, chickens scattered around his boots. A dog barked once, then seemed to lose interest. The cottages leaned slightly to the side as if they had given up long ago. A single cart creaked past, driven by a man too tired to even glance at Rowan. No one ran up to greet the bard. No one gasped with excitement. In real medieval life, bards weren't glamorous celebrities. They were wandering workers, like traveling repairmen or part-time entertainers. People liked music, sure, but they didn't treat bards like heroes. Rowan walked toward the tavern anyway. He didn't have much choice. If he wanted a meal, or a roof, or even a place to sit, the tavern was the only option. His legs felt heavy, like they were filled with wet sand instead of bone. Pushing the tavern door open, he stepped inside and was greeted by the usual mixture of smells: sweat, broth, overturned ale, and damp straw. The smoke from the hearth curled lazily through the air, turning everything slightly hazy. Behind the counter, the tavern keeper looked up. He was a round man with a gray beard and weary eyes. "You a singer?" the man asked. Rowan nodded with a tired half-smile. "A bard, yes." The tavern keeper gave a shrug that meant absolutely nothing. "We've had one last week," Rowan waited, knowing what came next. The tavern keeper wiped a cup with a rag that did not look remotely clean and continued, "If you want food, you can play tonight, but we can't promise coin. Folks here aren't big spenders." This too was normal, and terrible, and impossible to argue with. Rowan simply said, "I'll play." He knew he had to. He was bone-tired, hungry, and cold, but arguing about payment would only make the tavern keeper think he was difficult, and difficult bards got nothing. He sat at a simple table, set down his lute, and stretched his fingers slowly, as if preparing to wrestle a bear. His knuckles popped in a painful but familiar way. Then he closed his eyes. For a moment, he imagined what it would be like to rest for a week. Just 1 week. No singing, no walking, no performing, no pretending. Just sleep in a warm bed that didn't smell like livestock. But medieval life didn't hand out luxuries like that. He opened his eyes again, sighed, and began tuning his lute. A bard's life sucked. That much was absolutely true, but it was the only life Rowan knew. And even if it exhausted him, even if it wore down his body and spirit, he also knew this: somewhere in the world, someone would always need a story, a laugh, a song, a voice to fill the long, dark evenings. And as long as that need existed, Rowan would keep walking, keep singing, keep surviving, even if it sucked, even if it drained him, even if no one ever saw how hard it really was. He continued tightening the strings, listening to their faint, fragile notes. Outside, the village buzzed with small, ordinary noises. Inside, Rowan prepared himself for yet another night. Rowan finished tuning his lute, though "finished" was a generous word. The instrument still buzzed on one string and wheezed on another, but that was simply the nature of medieval craftsmanship. No matter how skilled the maker, time and travel warped even the best wood. He looked around the tavern. A few villagers sat at rough wooden tables, silently eating bowls of barley stew. Their spoons clinked softly against earthenware bowls. The sound echoed faintly, blending with the distant crackle of the hearth as flames gnawed lazily at thick logs. No one paid much attention to him, also normal. A bard rarely made an entrance worth noticing. Rowan could have walked in juggling lit torches, and most people still would have looked up only long enough to judge whether he'd damaged the floor. He sighed, leaning back in the chair as the tavern door creaked open again. A cold gust blew in, swirling the smoke. A woman stepped inside, bundled tightly in a wool cloak. She carried a basket of apples that looked bruised and soft. When she spotted Rowan, she nodded politely, but without any real curiosity. "Another bard?" she murmured to the innkeeper. The innkeeper said without looking up. Rowan smiled at them both, though he felt invisible. That too was part of the life, always seen but never noticed. He picked up his lute and strummed a gentle pattern to warm up. The notes floated weakly at first, then steadied into a soft rhythm. A few villagers glanced over, not because they wanted to listen, but because the sound interrupted their thoughts. Rowan knew that look. It meant, is he going to be loud? Please don't be loud. Medieval people loved music. But only at the right time, in the right way, and never when their stew was too hot or too cold or too bland or too salty. People were picky about strange things, Rowan had learned. Some wanted him to sing only heroic tales. Some demanded funny songs. Some hated funny songs. Some insisted that he never sing the tragic ones. And some took offense at songs they had never heard simply because the tune sounded too southern or northern. Being a bard wasn't just performing, it was navigating the moods of dozens of strangers who all disagreed about what music should feel like. The lute vibrated beneath his fingers, the wooden body warm against his chest. As he played absent-mindedly, Rowan remembered an older bard once telling him, "There is no such thing as pleasing everyone. Your job is to disappoint the fewest people possible." Rowan didn't know whether to laugh or cry at that advice. The villagers finished their meals one by one, scraping bowls and wiping mouths on sleeves. The tavern began to fill with quiet conversation, murmurs blending into a steady hum. It wasn't lively, just comfortably dull, the atmosphere of people who repeated the same daily routines year after year. At some point, the innkeeper stepped toward Rowan. "You'll play after sundown," he said. "Folk will be ready then," Rowan nodded. Sundown meant hours away. Hours during which he had nothing to do except exist quietly in a room full of strangers who didn't particularly care about him. So he leaned back in his chair, letting his eyes drift across the dusty wooden beams overhead. Shadows gathered in the corners, dim and slow, as if the tavern itself were growing sleepier by the minute. His fingers traced lazy patterns on the strings. He wondered how many bards before him had sat in this same tavern, feeling the same loneliness wrapped in the same tired bones. Probably dozens, maybe hundreds, maybe more. Bards wandered everywhere, scattering across kingdoms like restless leaves blown in the wind. Some became court musicians. Some became beloved legends. But most, like Rowan, drifted endlessly from village to village, forgotten as soon as they left. He rubbed his eyes, thinking of the many roads behind him. The many nights sleeping on straw, the many times he'd been paid in soup or bread or a single candle stub instead of coins. Once, a farmer paid him with a button that might be valuable someday. It wasn't. Another time, a baker offered him half a burnt loaf because the dog refused to eat it. Rowan had eaten it anyway. The tavern hummed around him. The warmth of the fire made his eyelids heavy. For a moment, he allowed his head to droop, letting sleep tug at him gently. He was used to napping whenever he could. True rest was rare, precious, unpredictable. His thoughts drifted like soft waves. He thought about the cities he had visited, the markets he had passed, the nights he had sung until his voice broke. He remembered standing before lords who judged him harshly and peasants who laughed too loudly. He remembered feasts where he was allowed to sit at the edge of the table but not touch any of the good food. He remembered being blamed when a noble's dog howled during a performance. He remembered storms, mud, hunger, and days where the road felt like an endless test. But he also remembered moments of quiet beauty, a child smiling at his lullaby, a lonely widow thanking him for a song he didn't even remember performing, a traveler who walked with him for 2 days, sharing stories that made the miles feel shorter. Being a bard sucked. But it also held small pockets of warmth, tiny flickers of humanity that kept him going when everything else felt too heavy. He drifted deeper into his thoughts, losing track of time until the innkeeper nudged his shoulder gently. "It's nearly sundown," Rowan blinked awake. Outside the windows, the sky glowed with deep amber and fading pink. Shadows stretched long across the village. The evening was settling in quietly, like a blanket being pulled across the land. Rowan stood slowly, stretching his sore limbs. He lifted his lute once more, feeling its familiar weight anchor him. Tonight would be another small performance, another night of forced smiles and polite nods and hopeful glances toward the coin jar. But it was also another night of doing the only thing he had ever truly known how to do. He walked toward the center of the tavern, where the light from the hearth painted the floor in warm orange patches. The room quieted slightly, villagers turning their heads in his direction, finally noticing him, if only because they expected him to entertain them. Rowan exhaled softly, letting his breath cleanse the stale anxiety in his chest. Then he raised the lute and began to play. The first few notes drifted through the tavern like cautious visitors, unsure whether they were welcome. Rowan played softly, letting the melody unfurl at its own pace, slow and heavy like a lazy river. The villagers settled a bit deeper into their seats, some folding their arms, some leaning their elbows on the table, some simply staring into their bowls, as if the music tickled thoughts they had forgotten they possessed. No applause. No cheers. Just listening, or something close to it. Rowan had learned long ago that medieval audiences rarely clapped. Clapping was mostly reserved for festivals or noble celebrations, and even then it was half-hearted. Peasants didn't waste their energy on displays of enthusiasm. Life already demanded too much of their bodies. So Rowan never expected applause. If he finished a performance and no one threw turnips at him, he considered it a success. His fingers danced slowly across the strings. The melody was a simple one, an old tune about the turning of seasons, something his master bard had taught him years ago. The strings buzzed slightly from age, their sound not quite clean. But that rawness, that imperfect hum, was part of medieval music. It was never polished, never delicate, never finely precise. Instruments were handmade, lived outdoors, suffered the weather, and aged like farmers' boots. As Rowan played, he noticed a young boy near the corner staring at him with wide, curious eyes. Children were always the first to pay attention. Adults judged. Children listened. Rowan shifted smoothly into a gentler refrain, letting the notes curl around the boy like soft smoke. The boy blinked, leaning forward slowly. The tavern keeper stood behind the counter, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Rowan never knew whether tavern keepers liked or hated his music. They usually didn't bother saying, but they knew it brought in a bit more business on cold nights, so they tolerated it, and tolerance, Rowan had learned, was one of the highest forms of appreciation a medieval bard could hope for. He continued to play, letting the melody wander, take turns, repeat, drift, and soften. The tavern's atmosphere grew heavier, sleepier. A woman in the back began nodding off. A farmer stared at the wall, lost in distant thoughts. Even the fire seemed to crackle more slowly, as if listening. Rowan let the final note fade into the warm air. It disappeared gradually, like a sigh dissolving into silence. No clapping, of course. Instead, a man at the nearest table said, "Not bad," which in medieval tavern language was equivalent to a standing ovation. Rowan nodded politely and moved into another tune, this time a narrative ballad, one of those long, wandering tales about knights, damsels, dragons, and improbable moral lessons. These ballads were dangerous to perform because if Rowan forgot even one verse, some listener inevitably corrected him with smug authority. But tonight he didn't worry. The villagers looked too tired to care about accuracy. They wanted something to fill the quiet, something to soften the edges of their long day. Rowan's voice joined the lute, low and calm, carrying the story like a slow-moving tide. He didn't push it. He didn't try to impress. He simply told the tale the way bards had done for centuries. Steadily, patiently, with gentle repetition that lulled the listener into a half-dreaming state. The lyrics flowed, through forests deep where shadows tide, a weary knight would often ride. His voice wasn't beautiful. It didn't need to be. Medieval music was never about perfection, it was about presence, about filling the cold nights with something warmer than silence. As he reached the middle of the ballad, Rowan's throat began to tighten. Singing for hours every evening had a price, soreness, dryness, a constant rasp that never fully healed. He took a small sip of the watered-down ale the tavern keeper had placed on a table for him. It helped a little. Not much. He resumed the song. By the time he reached the end, and so the night at last found rest, beneath the oak where dreams grew best. Most of the tavern's occupants looked relaxed, softened, almost drowsy. Rowan felt the same. Performing always drained him. Not just his voice, not just his fingers, but something deeper, something in the chest, the spirit, the quiet part of him that held all his stories. Each performance took a piece of him and scattered it into the ears of strangers. And strangers rarely gave anything back. The tavern keeper approached him again, carrying a small bowl. "Your supper," he said. Rowan peered inside. It was a thin stew, mostly broth, with one piece of carrot floating like a lonely raft in a muddy pond. Still, food. He nodded gratefully. "Thank you," the tavern keeper grunted, which might have meant, "You're welcome," or "Don't make a mess," or "Try not to scare away paying customers." With tavern keepers, It was often impossible to interpret the grunts accurately. Rowan ate slowly, savoring the warmth more than the flavor. Warmth was rare. Warmth was luxury. Even this simple bowl felt comforting in its own humble way. The villagers resumed their conversations. The boy in the corner whispered something to his mother. A few people drifted out into the evening. Wooden stools scraped softly against the floor. The performance was over. Rowan wiped his mouth and went to speak with the tavern keeper about lodging, always a tense conversation. The tavern keeper scratched his beard thoughtfully. "We don't have room in the beds," he said. "There's a lot of travelers tonight, but you can sleep near the hearth. Floor's softer there." Rowan had slept on far worse. "That's fine," he said. "You'll need to be up early," the man added. "Can't have you blocking the morning cooking?" Rowan smiled faintly. "Of course." He spread his cloak near the hearth once the tavern emptied. The fire cast a dim glow across the wooden floor. The warmth seeped into Rowan's bones as he settled down, his lute beside him like a tired companion. He closed his eyes. The room was quiet except for the soft crackle of embers and the occasional creak of the tavern walls adjusting to the night's chill. For a moment just before sleep claimed him, Rowan wondered whether his life would ever become easier, whether he would ever find a place to rest, a place to belong, a place where he wouldn't have to earn every scrap of comfort by giving away another piece of himself. He doubted it. But he also knew he would wake tomorrow and keep walking, keep singing, keep being the tired, invisible thread that stitched stories across the kingdom. Because that was a bard's life. It sucked, but it was his. And tomorrow, someone somewhere would need a song. The fire crackled in soft, uneven rhythms, like someone gently tapping on the wooden walls with a slow, sleepy hand. Rowan lay curled beneath his cloak, listening to the embers shift and whisper. His lute rested beside him, wrapped in cloth to protect it from the night's damp breath. The tavern was quiet now, properly quiet. Not the kind of silence that came during daylight, when everyone held their breath for the next task or the next worry. But the heavy, complete silence of a room that had finished its business for the day. The silence of weary walls and tired beams and sleeping dust. Rowan breathed deeply. His ribs ached slightly from the day's walk, the night's singing, and the endless cycle of doing both. Medieval life had no softness. Even rest felt like something earned rather than given. As he drifted toward sleep, he sensed a faint draft slipping under the tavern door, brushing gently across the floorboards. It carried the scent of damp hay, cold earth, and some distant chimney burning a different kind of wood. Then, footsteps. Slow, cautious footsteps. Rowan opened his eyes a sliver. The tavern keeper moved through the dimness, carrying a candle that cast a warm, trembling halo around him. He didn't look at Rowan. He simply checked the shutters, the bolts, the hearth, all with the instinctive motions of someone who had done this every night for years. Satisfied, the tavern keeper blew out the candle and trudged upstairs. Rowan closed his eyes again. This time sleep came properly. He awoke before dawn. Not because he wanted to, but because medieval mornings had a habit of waking everyone whether they asked for it or not. The hearth had gone cold. His breath puffed in small clouds. Somewhere outside, a rooster crowed with the confidence of a creature that had never once worked for its supper. Rowan rubbed his eyes, feeling that heavy, grainy tiredness that no amount of sleep ever fully cured. The life of a bard allowed no true rest. He had to move with the light, travel with it, reach the next village before hunger reached him. He sat up slowly, joints stiff. His back complained. His knees cracked. His shoulders felt as if someone had swapped them with rocks during the night. "Ah," he groaned softly. The music profession. He packed his lute carefully, checking each string, each peg. The instrument was fragile, more fragile than anything else he owned, and absolutely essential. Without it, Rowan wasn't a bard. He was just another wanderer with empty hands. He dusted off his cloak, tightened the straps of his worn boots, and approached the front counter where the tavern keeper was already stirring a pot of early morning gruel with a large wooden spoon. Rowan cleared his throat. "Good morning." The tavern keeper glanced at him with that eternal expression of mild annoyance that came naturally to anyone who had worked with travelers for too long. "You're leaving early," he said. Rowan nodded. "Long road ahead." The man ladled a small portion of the gruel into a crude wooden bowl and pushed it toward Rowan. "For the music," Rowan blinked. That was surprisingly kind. "Thank you," he said with genuine warmth. The tavern keeper shrugged. It was quiet last night. People slept better with a tune. That was probably the closest thing to high praise Rowan would receive all month. He ate the gruel standing up, thick, plain, slightly smoky, but filling. Food didn't need to be exciting when you walked as much as Rowan did. It only needed to exist. When he finished, he offered the bowl back. The tavern keeper took it without a word. Rowan slung the loot across his back, opened the tavern door, and stepped into the morning. Cold air greeted him immediately. Brushing past his cheeks with a sharpness that suggested winter, was thinking of visiting early that year. The sky was still pale, almost colorless, with just the faintest suggestion of sunrise gathering at the edges. The village was barely awake. A woman carrying water trudged past him without a greeting. A boy chased a chicken. A thin haze of chimney smoke hovered over the rooftops like a tired ghost. Rowan stretched his arms, winced at the result, and began walking. His boots sank slightly into the damp dirt path, leaving heavy footprints behind him. Birds fluttered overhead, already more awake than he felt. Somewhere a dog barked, then gave up halfway through. Rowan's mind wandered as his feet carried him forward. He thought about all the things that made being a bard so unbearably difficult. The constant hunger, the unpredictable weather, the endless walking, the judgment of strangers, the lack of steady income, the pressure to remember hundreds of verses, the expectation to always be cheerful, the aching fingers, the sore back, the loneliness that settled deeper than any song could reach. And yet, he also thought of the small, quiet moments that gave the life its only real sweetness. The child's wide-eyed wonder, the rare villager who hummed along softly, the occasional night when a noble tossed him an actual coin instead of leftover bread, the warmth of a hearth after a long rain, the peaceful rhythm of telling a story that had been told for generations, the feeling that in his own wandering way he was carrying tiny sparks of history across the land. His life sucked, truly, but it was also strangely meaningful in a way he couldn't quite explain. He walked for hours, the road winding like an endless serpent ahead of him. The fields slowly changed color as sunlight brushed them awake. Dew glistened on the grass, tiny droplets catching the light like forgotten jewels. Eventually, Rowan reached a fork in the road, one path leading to another village, the other disappearing into a forest dense with shadows. He paused. He consulted the faint memory of a map someone had scratched into a wooden board weeks ago. Both paths led somewhere. Both led to people. Both led to performances and taverns and restless nights on uneven floors. But one path, the forest path, looked quieter. Rowan stood there for a moment, listening to the morning wind whisper through the trees. Then he smiled. Quiet was rare. And rare things were worth chasing. So he tightened the strap on his lute, drew a deep breath, and walked toward the forest. The trees welcomed him with cool shade, soft earth, and the sound of branches gently shifting overhead, a natural lullaby for a man who carried too many weary miles in his bones. Rowan continued on, and the story of his tired, wandering life stretched on with him, step by slow, steady step. And so the sleepy tale drifted onward. The villagers of Elderwick settled once more into their nightly rituals, each one stranger and slower than the last. The cobbled paths grew quiet except for the steady shuffle of tired feet returning to hearths where embers glowed like fading fireflies. Even the animals seemed to share in these odd medieval sleep customs, cows lounging half asleep in barns, chickens nodding off on rafters, and the village cats drifting between naps like tiny furry spirits. By the riverbank, old Torwin the weaver finished tying his final dream knots, little loops in leftover thread that he believed captured wandering thoughts so they wouldn't bother him in the night. He hung them above his straw mattress, convinced each knot held a fragment of calm. Near the mill, Mildred the baker arranged her slumber stones, smooth river pebbles warmed by the oven's hearth. She placed them carefully around her bed to keep nighttime chills away and, according to her, keep nightmares from creeping under the door like mist. Even the town watchman, Derald, had his peculiar routine, pacing in slow circles before lying down fully clothed on his bench so he could fall asleep faster by pretending he wasn't trying. As odd as it seemed, Derald claimed he drifted off instantly whenever he acted like he didn't care. And across the hill, in the little wooden cottage with the creaky shutters, young Ilara whispered her nightly worries into a hollow reed habit she picked up from old Agnes, who swore the wind would carry them away. Elara would place the reed outside her window and fall asleep believing the breeze had softened her burdens. The village, strange as ever, eased into deeper quiet. The moon climbed higher, washing every rooftop in pale silver. The candles guttered out one by one. The sleepy rituals, strange as they were, worked well enough. The villagers slid into dreams without hurry, without urgency, only drifting as gently as falling feathers. And Elderwick remained exactly as it had always been, slow, peaceful, and filled with the most wonderfully boring sleep habits the medieval world had ever known. And so, as Elderwick slept deeper, its dreams began to swirl like soft mist drifting over the rooftops. The dreams of the villagers were peculiar things, half story, half habit, stitched together by years of practice and superstition. In a place where people believed spoons stirred dreams, sheep stopped spirits, and slumber dust soothed the night, it was only natural that those dreams would become just as strange as the customs that shaped them. Old Agnes, who had scattered her nightly herbs with a dramatic flourish, dreamt of enormous lavender fields stretching farther than her eyes could see. The stems were so tall they brushed the sky, and the purple blossoms shimmered like stars. She wandered through them peacefully, her hands gliding along the glowing petals. In her dream, every flower hummed a sleepy tune, and she hummed along, feeling lighter with each step until she almost drifted above the ground. Bram the shepherd, meanwhile, found himself dreaming that his sheep were lecturing him gently, of course, about forming straight lines instead of circles. One particularly plump sheep named Model was tapping a chalkboard with a hoof, explaining geometric alternatives to ward off imaginary night spirits. Bram nodded dutifully in his dream, promising to try a triangle next time, maybe a square if the sheep approved. Little Tessa, with her spoon tucked under her pillow, floated through a land where oversized kitchen utensils planted themselves like trees. A fork forest glittered under a moon made of soft butter. Spoons sprouted from the ground like silver saplings, each one stirring clouds overhead. Tessa giggled as she drifted past them, her feet never touching the dream soil. The sky rippled like warm milk above her. Torwin the Weaver dreamt of threads, endless, shimmering threads stretching across a vast meadow. Some threads twinkled like starlight, others glowed like golden sunbeams, and a few hummed like distant lullabies. He gathered the threads in his hands and wove them into enormous drowsy tapestries that covered the horizon in waves of soft color. Each time he finished a tapestry, it folded itself gently into a resting shape like a giant sigh. Even Dream Darold, despite claiming he didn't believe in sleep rituals, found himself nodding off inside a dream where he patrolled a cloud. Nothing ever happened on the cloud patrol. The cloud simply drifted, soft and quiet, while Darold leaned on his imaginary spear and happily looked at nothing. The emptiness soothed him in a way he would never admit while awake. But the most curious dream belonged to the village itself. Ye's the village. For Elderwick, tucked beneath layers of superstition, herbs, and midnight whispers, sometimes dreamt too. Its dream was a gentle one, a vision of lanterns glowing softly along every pathway, guiding wandering thoughts back to their sleepers. Roofs glistened in the moonlight, wells hummed low lullabies, and even the cobblestones warmed themselves as though they too wished to rest. All of Elderwick breathed in harmony, wrapped in a night so peaceful it felt as though time itself paused to yawn. And still, the night drifted on, steady and calm, as dreams rolled lazily across the slumbering village like a tide of quiet wonder. And so the night carried on, stretching its quiet, slow fingers across Elderwick. The moon climbed higher, pale and gentle, casting silver light through the thatched roofs and over cobbled streets. Shadows of trees danced softly along the walls, as if the night itself were tiptoeing through the village, careful not to wake anyone. The air smelled faintly of earth and herbs, of wood smoke and distant river water, a mixture so familiar it wrapped the villagers in an invisible blanket. Inside their homes, the villagers' dreams twisted and meandered like lazy streams. Old Agnes wandered through fields of luminescent lavender, each blossom vibrating in tiny, sleepy hums. She traced her fingers along the stems, marveling at how every flower seemed to bend just for her touch. Somewhere in her dream, a soft breeze whispered old lullabies she had not sung in decades, and she hummed along without realizing her lips moved. Bram's flock of sheep continued their lecture in his dream. He had tried triangles, squares, and even a few poorly formed hexagons. Model, the plump sheep, shook her head disapprovingly, but then smiled when Bram promised to bring them pastries in the next imaginary village meeting. Bram felt oddly satisfied, though he knew that upon waking, none of this would make sense. Tessa drifted further through her spoon-stirred dreamland. Giant ladles formed gentle bridges over shallow rivers of cream. Forks sprouted from the soft ground like skeletal trees, their tines catching moonlight like fine silver threads. She tiptoed over a rolling spoonhill, feeling a curious weightlessness in her chest. For the first time, Tessa thought that maybe dreams were better than reality, quieter, softer, more obedient. Torwin, the weaver, found that his tapestry threads had grown enormous, stretching from one horizon to the next. He wove clouds into the fabric, pulling the mist into smooth, drowsy shapes. Each thread hummed a lullaby in its own key, creating a symphony of sleepy colors and gentle tones. He realized he could weave without end, because dreams were patient, and the night waited for no one in particular. Even Derold, the watchman, who had insisted on pretending he wasn't asleep, found himself in a dream of complete quiet. He patrolled invisible streets atop clouds, leaning lazily on a thin wooden staff that never broke and never required his attention. He could march forever without exhaustion, and no one would demand anything of him. The emptiness was surprisingly comforting, though he would deny it if awake. And above all of this, the village itself seemed to hum with slumber. Elderwick dreamt of its rooftops glowing faintly in silver light, of its wells murmuring soft lullabies, of lanterns lighting paths that no one needed to follow, but that existed nonetheless. The streets stretched like gentle ribbons, guiding the villagers in their sleep, and the trees whispered softly in rhythms that matched the heartbeat of the town. Somewhere along the river, a faint splash broke the quiet, and the water rippled with shimmering reflections of stars. The sound was gentle enough not to disturb the sleep of anyone nearby, yet it added a strange, comforting rhythm to the night. The river carried whispers of the night's stories downstream, murmuring them quietly into distant fields, as if even water wanted to remember the peculiar habits of Elderwick. And through it all, the villagers slept, each in their own odd, gentle way, secure in the rhythms they had invented over decades. No one rushed, no one panicked, no one needed more than what the night offered: calm, quiet, slow-moving peace. The moon began to dip slightly toward the horizon, though it was still high enough to bathe the village in light. A soft wind drifted through the open windows, carrying faint hints of lavender, mint, and wood smoke, tousling blankets and nudging sleepy heads into deeper dreams. Somewhere a cat purred, another dog sighed, and even the crows perched silently on distant trees, dozing with one eye half closed. And Elderwick, strange and sleepy, ordinary and peculiar, continued to dream, as if the world itself had decided for one long, gentle night that nothing needed to happen at all. And so the night deepened further over Elderwick, stretching itself like a slow, lazy river over the rooftops and fields. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant pine, blending with the faint aroma of herbs from the villagers' gardens. The world seemed to slow, as though even time itself had decided to pause, giving the village permission to drift deeper into dreams. In her cottage, old Agnes rolled over in her straw mattress, her dream lavender fields now joined by faintly glowing moonflowers. They bent toward her as she walked, brushing softly against her hands. She hummed in her sleep, unaware that the soft vibrations were matching the whispering wind outside. Somewhere deep in the night, she imagined herself floating above the flowers, the petals brushing past her like a gentle river current. Bram the shepherd's dreams had taken on an even stranger rhythm. The sheep that lectured him about shapes now spoke in rhyme, counting steps and lines in ways Bram didn't understand. He tried to keep up but eventually gave in, nodding repeatedly as the plump model began reciting a poem about the sun and the moon. Bram, exhausted even in his dreams, simply smiled, feeling the slow lull of night in every hoofbeat and echoing word. Little Tessa's dreamland expanded as well. Rivers of cream flowed into pools of honey, over which bridge-like spoons curved gracefully. Forests of forks towered high, casting faint shadows that danced across invisible hills. She floated, weightless, laughing quietly at the absurdity of it all, while tiny wind spirits carried whispers of past meals and half-remembered lullabies. Everything was soft, pliable, and entirely under the sway of the night's quiet rules. Torwin the weaver's tapestry threads stretched endlessly, forming bridges across entire dreamscapes. Each thread hummed gently, vibrating in harmony with the soft rhythm of the village's collective breath. He wove entire hills and valleys, mountains and clouds, rivers and bridges, and still found himself with enough threads to weave another layer of peaceful twilight. The act of weaving seemed endless, soothing, almost hypnotic. Even Derald, the watchman, drifted through skies of dream clouds, patrolling streets that weren't there, climbing invisible stairs, passing doors that opened only to show other clouds. He remained vigilant, as always, but in dreams, vigilance was easy. He moved slowly, letting the night carry him, and felt the rare luxury of weightless calm. Outside, Elderwick itself seemed to breathe in unison with its dreamers. The lanterns along the streets glowed softly, lighting pathways that led nowhere and everywhere at once. Roofs shimmered under moonlight. The chimneys sent soft spirals of smoke into the sky, and the river murmured secrets to the trees, secrets that would never be fully understood, only felt. Even the wind seemed to hum, brushing gently past windows, doors, and shutters, as though carrying lullabies for the entire village. A single owl, silent and watchful, perched on a crooked branch. Its large eyes reflected the moonlight, and it blinked slowly, almost as if it were participating in the calm, meditative rhythm of Elderwick's night. Somewhere a dog sighed, another cat curled on a warm windowsill, and distant sheep shifted in their pens, settling into the soft cadence of the world around them. The night pressed on, slow, deliberate, endlessly patient. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the trickle of water, the faint creak of beams, became part of a gentle, unbroken lullaby. No one rushed. No one spoke loudly. Nothing disturbed the fragile harmony. Time itself seemed to stretch, pulled by the collective weight of the village's slow breathing. And as the hours passed, Elderwick continued to dream, perfectly content in its odd, gentle, peaceful way. The villagers remained asleep, drifting through their peculiar nighttime rituals, their dreams weaving together like a soft tapestry that held the village in a quiet embrace. The world was still, the night was deep, and Elderwick slept on. The moon drifted higher, a pale lantern in the sky, and its silver light fell gently across the sleeping village. Shadows lengthened and curled, moving with a lazy, almost sentient rhythm. Each rooftop, each chimney, each tiny window became part of the night's soft, drowsy choreography. Old Agnes, still immersed in her dream of glowing lavender fields, now found herself walking along a river of silver threads. The threads shimmered like spider silk in moonlight, stretching endlessly. Tiny lights, like fireflies, floated above the water, reflecting off the surface in slow, hypnotic patterns. She felt weightless, as if the dream had lifted her from the straw mattress and carried her gently across the night. Bram's flock of sheep, no longer lecturing, now danced. Each hoofbeat created faint ripples in the dreamland soil, soft waves that lapped against invisible shores. Bram followed along, shuffling clumsily, laughing softly in his sleep. Somewhere Mottle the plump sheep sang a faint melody, off-key but mesmerizing, which Bram found himself humming even without knowing it. Tessa, in her ever-expanding spoon and fork dreamscape, discovered a tiny door beneath a rolling hill of ladles. It opened onto a room entirely made of cream-colored clouds. The clouds shifted as she stepped forward, forming stairs and bridges that never stayed the same for more than a moment. A faint breeze carried scents of honey, bread, and herbs, and she floated further into the dream, her laughter quiet and melodic, blending seamlessly with the night's soft rhythm. Torwin the weaver's threads now intertwined into a bridge spanning from the river to the forest. As he wove, the threads hummed in increasingly complex patterns, each vibration rippling outward. The threads formed intricate shapes, some geometric, some wildly organic, all merging into an endless tapestry of sleepy wonder. Torwin felt a rare, profound peace as he wove, a sense that the world, at least in dreams, could be orderly and calm. Darrell, atop his cloud patrol, noticed the wind shifting in peculiar ways. Faint trails of glowing dust floated past, tracing the paths of the villagers' dreams. He followed one, curious despite himself, and discovered it led to Elderwick itself. The village, even in its sleep, seemed alive, a breathing organism of slumber. The streets hummed faintly, the rooftops sighed in the moonlight, and the lanterns flickered gently, as if nodding in agreement with the rhythm of the night. The river whispered softly, carrying reflections of stars downstream. Each ripple caught the moonlight, scattering it in gentle patterns over the banks. Crickets, long silent, began to hum quietly, providing a faint, rhythmic accompaniment to the night. The trees swayed gently, leaves brushing against one another, creating soft rustling sounds that blended with the distant murmurs of the sleeping villagers. Even the animals seemed to understand the pace of the night. Dogs sighed in their sleep, cats curled tighter into cozy windowsills, chickens nestled into their roosts, and a lone owl blinked slowly, its large eyes reflecting the calm and patience of the village. Everything moved together in quiet harmony, each element part of a slow, meditative rhythm. The night deepened, and the dreams of Elderwick intertwined more tightly. Agnes' silver-threaded river merged with Torwin's tapestry. Bram's dancing sheep wandered across the spoon and fork landscapes of Tessa, and even Darrell's drifting cloud patrol passed silently over the glowing lantern-lit streets. Everything became one endless, soft, sleepy panorama. Time seemed to stretch, elastic and slow. The hours passed without urgency, unnoticed, unmeasured. Sleep ruled completely, and the village existed only in the gentle sway of dreams, in the soft sighs of tired bodies, and in the endless, unbroken rhythm of quiet. And so Elderwick slept on, deeper and deeper, a village suspended in its own peculiar, peaceful world, where every shadow, every whisper, and every heartbeat contributed to the slow, perfect lull of the medieval night. As the night stretched onward, Elderwick remained suspended in its own dreamlike rhythm. The villagers slept soundly, wrapped in blankets, swaddled in wool, and cradled by their peculiar habits. Even the wind seemed to tiptoe across the rooftops, brushing chimneys and thatch softly, careful not to disturb a single slumbering soul. Old Agnes, still wandering her endless lavender fields and silver-threaded rivers, felt herself drifting toward a gentle awakening in her dream. The flowers bowed to her as she passed, petals brushing her hands and shoulders, and the moonlight softening around her gave a warm, drowsy glow. She realized, somewhere deep in her mind, that morning would soon arrive, but for now there was no hurry. She floated along her river until it merged with Torwin's threads, the tapestry of the dreamland stretching wider than she had ever imagined. Bram's dancing sheep slowed, stepping gently over the rivers and clouds of Tessa's spoon and fork dreamscape. Model hummed softly, almost imperceptibly now, as Bram's body twitched in the rhythm of sleep. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Bram felt the soft tug of dawn approaching, but he allowed the slow sway of dreams to carry him until the light insisted upon its presence. Tessa drifted across cloud bridges and rolling hills of cream, feeling lighter than air. The scents of honey and herbs lingered faintly, mingling with the first hints of morning dew. She stepped lightly, giggling softly in her dream, feeling a comforting calm settle in her chest. Even as the night prepared to end, she felt no fear, only the gentle awareness that the village's rhythms would continue long after she awoke. Torwin, the weaver, finished a final stretch of threads that stretched from one horizon to the other. He wove the last strands with careful precision, allowing the tapestry to fold in on itself like a sigh. The dream landscape now encompassed every corner of Elderwick, every rooftop, every tree, every lamplit path. In this moment, Torwin understood something he had never realized fully. Sleep, dreams, and rhythm were as much a part of life as work, song, or story. They were threads that bound the village together, fragile but enduring. Darrell, on his cloud patrol, drifted lower as the first pale light of dawn began to touch the sky. The glowing dust trails he had been following shimmered faintly, then dissolved into golden rays as the sun peeked over the horizon. For the first time that night, Darrell felt a tiny, unspoken satisfaction, the kind that only comes from witnessing a night passed in perfect, uninterrupted calm. Outside, Elderwick slowly stirred. The wind shifted, carrying warmer air that hinted at the coming day. Birds began to trill softly, a quiet chorus announcing morning without urgency. The river reflected the first glimmers of sunlight, and dew sparkled across fields, rooftops, and window panes. One by one, the villagers awoke. Old Agnes stretched, blinking slowly, feeling the lingering calm of her dream river and lavender fields. Bram's sheep bleated softly, nudging him awake, and he laughed quietly, remembering the dancing herd of his dreams. Tessa opened her eyes, still feeling the gentle weightlessness of the spoon and fork landscapes in her chest. Torwin yawned and adjusted the threads of his own waking thoughts, carrying the night's calm into the day ahead. Derald sighed, rising from his bench with the tiniest smile, grateful for the uninterrupted night behind him. And Eldrick, still quiet but fully awake, returned to its ordinary routines, people fetching water, tending animals, preparing meals, yet something subtle had changed. The slow, sleepy rhythms of the night lingered in every step, every breath, every glance. The village had survived another night, peaceful and strange as always. A small medieval world bound together by peculiar habits, gentle rituals, and the soft embrace of sleep. The sun rose higher, spilling warm light across the rooftops, illuminating the village in gold and shadow. Life would resume its ordinary pace, messy, unpredictable, occasionally frustrating, but the memory of the night's calm remained. Eldrick had slept, dreamt, and survived, each villager carrying forward the gentle lesson of their strange, slow, and perfectly boring medieval night. And so, with the dawn, Eldrick opened its eyes, ready for another day, knowing that night would return eventually, bringing with it the same calm, peculiar magic, the same slow embrace, and the same quietly enduring peace. The end.